Yeah, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Miliaku, for that amazing start of the day. I think there is no better way to position ourselves than with that, those kind of really embodied exercises and activities. And I would like to talk to you about something I called, I mean, everything is a working, it's a working title, but I've called it Coming to Terms with Positionality, Embodying Privilege and Subalternity in Design and Research. And it connects a bit with the last thing that we were discussing, or that Miliaku was asking us to reflect on, namely that idea of how do you recognize also some problematic positions that you might also take yourself in your practice and in your ways of operating. First, I would come with some kind of disclaimer that it is more complex than it looks like, but I would start by saying that I'm a white, cisgender, middle-class man. That would position me very, let's say, kind of high in the level of privilege and oppression. But I am also a Colombian without permanent EU residence, a precarious worker, and a feminist father. And I don't do this to, I don't know, gain any recognition. I don't want a badge for it. But it's to also show that we kind of share these kind of patterns of oppression and oppressiveness in our different contexts where we operate. I will make some initial notes on my positionality. This, again, as I told you, I'm going to bore you to death, but I'm going to try to just go quickly through it to kind of have you get a glimpse or an idea of where these ideas are coming from. And then I will try to share with you and make you walk with me in two scenes or two projects, two scenarios where I've been involved that kind of bring to the fore or make emerge certain issues about this idea of positionality that we're dealing with today. So this is some pictures of my doctoral dissertation that is called Walking the World of Design. I'm not going to tell you what it is about it. Again, I don't want to bore you so much. But I just want to say something about the title, Caminar la Palabra, which is not so much the literal, but the textual translation of walking the word. It's an expression coined by the indigenous peoples of southeastern Colombia when they started this massive mobilization in 2013. And they used this as a kind of slogan for referring to the way that they were taking to the streets to negotiate opinions, ideas, and to also put into question certain ideas of how the organization of society should be. It's usually, or it can be equated, or it can be kind of related to these certain expressions in the global north, which, curiously enough, are related to money, but like put your money where your mouth is, you know, like putting the words into action. But in this case, is kind of putting the words in motion, and by walking, recognizing your truth and the truth of the others. I speak about this because it has to do with how I've also engaged in my practice. It has been kind of, by walking, it's a way of kind of positioning myself and positioning myself in certain contexts. So by walking the word, I'm kind of putting in negotiation also those notions. This also has to do with an engagement with the concrete, and this is something that feminist Chicana scholar Maria Lugones used to talk a lot about. She would say that, this is from one of her most famous books called Pilgrimages, and she would say, theoreticians of society and politics have often conceived of themselves as perched up high, looking at or making up the social from a disengaged position. The crucial disengagement is not necessarily the disengagement of political impartiality or neutrality, but a disengagement from the concrete. And this idea of not wanting to engage with the concrete, with concrete issues, with concrete context, with concrete people, has also to do with this idea of not wanting to take a concrete position in a concrete place. Which, again, I'm not going to go through each of these quotes. I just want you to have a feeling and have a notion of where it's coming from. It's coming from this also decolonial notions, in this case of Rolando Vasquez, who also speaks about the position self, saying how the position self cannot assume to be the center of the world, but it has to be conscious of the plurality of worlds that is around her, and that the gender, the subject, is used intentionally. Which of course also resonates with things like what Donna Haraway would defend in Situated Knowledges, and what myself and a colleague, Michael Kathler, wrote in a book called Designing in Dark Times. And we posed this idea or this question, and is a key starting point is a question: from where does the subject, in this case the designer, speak? From which ethnic, cultural, gender, sexual, or class location? I am where I think is a basic epistemic premise to delegitimize claims of an only universal epistemology. It geo-historicizes and biogeographically locates knowledge. So the need to locate yourself, in this case, talking about this intersectional axis of oppression, of ethnic, cultural, gender, sexual, or class location, it's, let's say, a first call to start situating yourself as a designer. I will tell you just a little bit of background as well of how I started to approach this idea of situatedness, and with which we've been having also certain conversations with Balkan laboratories around. And it's on a project I've called, a notion I've called situated creative practices. And situated creative practices, you might say it's just a new term or a new name to frame certain creative practices that have to do with social engagement or socially engaged art, participatory design, transition design, but also with pedagogy, like radical pedagogies and pedagogy of the oppressed. But I'm trying to reflect more on two levels. On one level of the situatedness, I would like to reflect on the site and time specificity or sensitivity of the actions of how designers, artists, architects, or researchers develop certain site and time sensitive practices. I speak about sensitive and not specific. Maybe I'll tell you why in a bit, maybe not. And some other element of situatedness that has to do, and I think it connects to what we were speaking about we were embodying with Miliaku, with the critical positioning of the agent, of how you critically situate yourself or position yourself in relation to the context where you operate. So just to give you an idea of how I approached this, let's say it was kind of in a relatively traditional and institutionally bound research space. So I was working with I am still working with the Leuven and the LUCA School of Arts in Belgium. And I was working with the Faculty of Architecture, with a research group of design, and with a research group of art, of fine art. And let's say kind of the main action that I did to approach and to explore this idea of situatedness in their own practice is I did this one-on-one conversations with 19 researchers, artists, designers, practitioners from these different research groups. This was during COVID time, so yeah, that was perhaps good because it could be done online and it could all be recorded. And in these conversations that I had with these 19 agents, I will call them, I designed this protocol to through the conversation with them, try to position a project of themselves and to position the researcher or the agent. In terms of positioning the project, I designed 4 questions to let's say kind of assess the time sensitivity of the project, and 4 questions to assess the site sensitivity of the project. The time sensitivity was, I mean, those are like kind of sources that were like inspiring the questions. It's Kevin Lynch, I was going to say David Lynch. Kevin Lynch, what time is this place? Or Mi Won Kwon, site-specific art. And then we had the more difficult questions regarding the positioning of the researcher. So remember that we were talking about site and time sensitive practices, and on the other side, the critical positioning of the agent. And for positioning the researcher, those were the more like, difficult, confronting questions for the researchers and for myself as well. It had to do with two, let's say, axes. That one had to do with the level of privilege or subalternity of the practices that they were developing, or the level of oppressive or emancipatory of their practices. This was not at all meant to be an objective assessment to say like, oh, you are an oppressor because you're acting like this, or because you are far in the right or on the left. But it was just like a way of starting the conversation on situatedness. In fact, it was all an excuse to start a conversation on situatedness. So in terms of positioning the project, they were all quite, or at least they came up as being very time and site sensitive. If you see it, like it's to the right and to the top, it's the most time sensitive projects and science sensitive projects. But then in the positioning the researcher, we had much more like a difference in terms of how they confronted their own position. The y-axis, so the vertical axis, speaking about the oppressiveness or emancipatory nature of their practices, and the horizontal or the x-axis, the y-axis speaking about the privilege and subalternity. And in this, they were much more confronted. Why? Because I kind of designed this protocol of questions. One was supposed to help them locate their site of enunciation. So that's to locate the place from where you speak or operate. This would be usually done through like an intersectional lens. So understand from which, again, like I was saying in the other text, from which class, sexual, gender, race, ethnic location you're speaking from. But I used instead, let's say, not a framework, but a certain set of categories that were shared to me by an indigenous knowledge carrier, an artist from Southeast Colombia called Eider Calambas. And he suggested that there is perhaps 4 categories that can help us to locate or situate our place of enunciation. First, there is an epistemic category, ethico-political category. So ethico-political category means to what extent do you engage in causes related to the projects that you work on? Like you work on projects that are against gentrification. Are you also like taking a direct stance and doing mobilization or engaged in other groups that are taking action against gentrification? Or are you just profiting from working against gentrification for your work's sake? A second category is an economical category. So how do you engage in practices that are not necessarily bound by market capitalism or neoliberalism? So other ways of exchange, of knowledge, of goods, of services, etc. A third category would be an epistemic category. So to what extent do you accept other forms of knowledge that are different from the ones that perhaps you grew used to? And a fourth was an ontological category. So to what extent do you accept other forms of being, or I put it in these terms for my mostly European colleagues, to what extent do you accept other forms of spirituality? But you know, ontological and understanding would go beyond, let's say, modern notion of spirituality. But this was like just like 4 questions that I would ask the researchers in terms of to help them position themselves. And again, it was not a shaming situation or a situation to say like, oh, I'm so bad, or I'm so in the range of privilege. But it was to reflect on how much they have reflected on that and how much they have also then implemented that in their own practices. Because the other set of questions were related to oppressive and emancipatory, and that's where I used let's say, the intersectional lens to ask them to what extent they had taken into consideration issues or differences of class, gender, race, and sexuality and ability in their own practices. If they had ever considered it, if they had ever considered in their own artistic design, research, architectural practice, oh, there is, in this group, there is a difference of a gender, let's say, difference or a divergence. How do I take it into account for my practice and integrate it into the process that I'm working? And that was also very confronting because most of the people said, like, I had never thought about it. I've never thought how to integrate these issues in my own practice, except the people that were, I mean, all the migrants, the racialized, the gender or trans minorities that were also part of the researchers. So it was very telling of how the, I think, research landscape, but also art and design landscape operates by ignoring certain issues. And let's say kind of it tries to open a conversation. So again, it's not like an objective assessment, but more like trying to open a conversation towards issues and aspects that perhaps we've been neglecting for far too long. This as a kind of, after having asking them those like difficult conversations and confronting them to their own positionality, I try to tell them, okay, let's come to a more like a convivial gathering, and we organized this open school where we would share knowledge around our own practices in, let's say, kind of more experimental and alternative ways. So it was a symposium, again like this, but was nothing like a symposium. It was like more a space where we were sharing really with our bodies, with, for instance, there was, we inflated this big bubble, plastic bubble, and inside we were doing this cleaning practice as a kind of way of practicing a different way of engaging with space, also with cleaning practices that have a connotation or have a historic, have been historically charged to women. So it's also about like taking that role and seeing how you can do with certain gestures. But it was a way to also kind of embody all these different discussions that we've been having. Now I would like to share with you two scenes that let's say kind of put or have allowed me to kind of put into question this notion and this idea of positionality of within my own practice. The first one, I'm not entitling any of them by the title of the project, but more about for me the reflection that is behind it, and it also emerges from a previous conversation that we had with some of the people that are taking part of the trajectory, which I think it's great because it's a kind of ongoing loop and iterative form of following up a conversation. And this one I would call it the relationality of power. This is just for you to have an idea of how that kind of positionality was framed within this experience or scene. It was very much kind of inspired and making use and abuse of this notion brought forth by Marcus Miesen first in The Nightmare of Participation and ending in his doctoral thesis that is called Crossbenching. And he says crossbenching calls for a format of conflictual participation, no longer a process by which others are invited in, but a means of acting without mandate, as uninvited irritant. We should encourage the production of the uninvited outsider, who is unaware of existing protocols and who can enter an arena with nothing but creative intellect and the will to provoke change. So the first scene began in the beginning of 2014, when I, a Colombian designer, researcher, and educator, came to Genk, Belgium, to work as a doctoral research in the local art school, LUCA. Genk is a city founded around 3 coal mines at the beginning of the 20th century that later, in 1969, shifted its industry to manufacturing by attracting General Motors to open a major Ford factory in the city. Ford Genk definitely ceased its operations in December 2014, leaving the city in socioeconomic turmoil and politicians desperate to find new sources of labor and income for its inhabitants. Our response, me and a group of researchers we were working with, was to create a living lab called the Andre Markt. Our main motivation for creating this space, that was mostly funded by the city, was precisely to go out of the institutionalized space of the school and be able to embed our work and research within the local context. This sounds very nice and laudable, or at least it did for me for a lot of time, and it does to a certain extent still, but it is also very conflicting on several counts. First, the framing of a lab implies there is something to be examined and experimented with, in this case, the local inhabitants. Sorry, Baltan. I would not compare this to the humanitarian industry exposed by Renzo Martens, considering the power relations at play, but it is nevertheless problematic. Wouldn't it have been more honest if I would have just stuck to my academic role and stayed within the safe space of academia? We were a team of well-paid researchers with indefinite working contracts, operating in a context under major socioeconomic stress. Additionally, the city was investing taxpayers' money in a project that had no direct short-term benefit for local inhabitants, for the sake of design research. Shouldn't have we pushed instead for the public funding of other local initiatives with more direct and short-term impact? Third, we took our time. We spent more than a year at the beginning of the project collecting skills and stories of the local inhabitants, and another year at the end of the project designing a digital tool to map the local networks that we have been working with and that we have been developed in the city. We seem to be relatively missing the urgency of the context that the context was demanding. With these reflections, I don't want to neglect the value of what we did. I just profited so much, academically and professionally, from this project that I owe it to Genk to make these critical self-reflections. Again, there is no answer, it's just some ideas in the air. The second scene, which I've called The Gentrifier Gets Gentrified, takes place in Saint-Gilles, a municipality of Brussels. Earlier this year, Piano Fabrique, the local Flemish cultural center, launched a call for projects to address the growing polarization of the commune. This was manifested, according to the call, in the tension between the higher income residents establishing themselves in Saint-Gilles and the more working class and immigrant-based population that has historically been living there. Me and my partner responded to the call, enthusiastic about the prospect of working on an hyper-local project, as we live in the geographical center of the commune. Where the point is, that's where we live, and literally what you see around is the commune. And we won it. In this case, we did not feel as the uninvited outsider of Marcus Missen, but as artists playing the dual role of intervening agents and part of the community. Again, sounds so nice and romantic, but is it? Our project is called L'Agence Saint-Gilloise, an agency of intra-community tourism. We put into question one of the mechanisms that has created the so-called polarization, namely tourism, and strive for bringing forth the different narratives and experiences of the people of Saint-Gilles. Local inhabitants and associations are enthusiastic about our project and approach, but we cannot avoid putting into question our position for different reasons. First, we are not taking a frontal approach towards the elephant in the room, gentrification. As much as it is an issue inherent to our project, I feel we are first-line spectators to an unavoidable fate, the total gentrification of Saint-Gilles and the displacement of its historically diverse population. Aren't we being used to culture wash the social reconfiguration of the commune? 2. As much as we consider ourselves locals, we are also the stereotypical Bobo middle-class family. As much as we are striving to share the platform that we have and amplify the voices of the less privileged groups, shouldn't we also take a more radical stance against what we represent ourselves? And 3, by the time this project will end in January 2023, we will most likely be gentrified out of Saint-Gilles as well, being unable to afford the rent. Again, I do not wish to undermine the process we are undergoing because this is an ongoing project, but I do find it crucial to constantly problematize the roles we take as designers and researchers, even if it means confronting one's own position in a given context. Yeah, this is a sticker that is actually very present all around the commune. It says, here is gentrifying, here, like, yeah. I'll make some final notes in relation to both of these scenes that I have presented with you, and hopefully that would open up the conversation or discussion with you all. First, again, I mean, these are not meant to be theories. These are not meant to be like absolute ideas of what I think positionality should be, but it's, let's say, kind of trying to reflect on my own experience and how my own experience can serve as a basis for talking about it and for making this, taking this conversation further in terms of positionality. Because again, I recognize myself and my privileged position and my oppressive position in a certain context. First, positioning yourself, however critically at the beginning of a project, should not let you off the hook for the rest of the process. You say like, yeah, I critically position myself at the beginning, and then I can do whatever the fuck I want. Sorry, pardon my French. I think it should be actually something that, as Miyaku was also reflecting on, how can you design these mechanisms that allow you to reflect on perhaps every part of it. Perhaps you carry that mirror with you. It's not like that it's in different points, but that it's like a constant reflection that you have on you. And that's perhaps something to think, and I think Miyaku put it in a much more beautiful, embodied, poetic way. That is, how do you design that mechanism? I'm thinking about, I put it like in a very, let's say, kind of theoretical way. Then let's think in a practical way. How we design that mechanism to carry the mirror with us, to be kind of in a constant self-reflective, and I think Oli would have a lot to say about that, having written a master's thesis about self-reflective practice, or a PhD. Yeah, sorry. Second, as designers, researchers, artists, architects, agents, whatever, our agency is limited. Positioning also requires to understand other forces at play, so the relationality of power or the relationality of positionality. This also implies understanding that as much as you can stand in a position of relative privilege at some point, there are also others more powerful than you. And again, that should not be a thing to say to let you off the hook, but it's also to understand what are like the main interests and what are like the certain powers at play, to not lose sight of, like with all that is happening with this energy consumption, and say like, yeah, it's all our responsibility to let's say, kind of take a stand towards the situation. No, it's first of all the responsibility of the main polluters, the main people that are consuming the mostly, and of course of governments. So it's also understanding this kind of different power play or power relations that take place in our own positionality. Third, and I think these are all reflections that came within the prior conversation that we had, positionality should not, I mean, it sounds very impositive, but ought not to be equated to a moral choice being good or bad, but of constantly putting into question our position in a context. So it's an issue of problematizing, and this is a word I really like, and people sometimes interpret problematizing as trying to find problems. I don't think it's trying to find problems, but trying to question the things that have not been questioned, to frame it in a way of a problem, because perhaps that shows the urgency of it, and that shows the urgency for acting upon it. And that, you know, sometimes perhaps can show us that we can be both the good and the bad cop at once. You know, And that, again, I'm the gentrifier, but I'm also going to be gentrified. And it's sad, and at the same time it's not, I don't know. And fourth, critically positioning oneself should not lead to inaction. That's what I believe. Again, perhaps somebody would believe that it should. Like to that a nihilist attitude of saying like, okay, then if I critically position myself, I cannot do anything because I should not intervene in any other context, because always the interrelations of that intervention will be problematic. But instead, I think it should allow to articulate the interventions with the local workings of the context and its communities. This has to do, I mean, I've let's say kind of developed that idea, and I've developed it in my practice and in the reflection that I've emanated from my practice, from very kind of southern perspectives of social science research and also design work. So in the social sciences, from the participatory action research of Orlando Falsborda, who in the 60s he was working with the peasant, indigenous, and black communities of Colombia. And he revolutionized social research, because he started to say, like, for me, research is not about studying the context, like studying these people, but it's more about a transformative practice. How do we, through interacting with them, create like a kind of meshwork of collaboration that leads to a transformation of the social reality of the people that are there. So it's also like also Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed, that it's not just to kind of transmit a series of knowledge or to acquire a series of knowledge, but how can that kind of conversation become something that transforms the social reality of the people that are taking part, not that are being studied, but are taking part. And that has evolved, let's say, in way of discourse as something that Arturo Escobar has proposed as something he calls autonomous design. So how do communities arrive to design themselves in an autopoietic way? And how can we, as external agents, either if we're operating from the inside or from the relative inside or from the outside, how can we support that process of self-design? And that's how he defines it. So I would leave it on those kind of reflections and notes to open it up to the conversation, to anybody who wants to take part, and to perhaps the three participants who would come up to the stage.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo.